Ultimately, we composers analyze music to learn from it, to improve our own music. But what we learn depends on the questions we ask. In this lesson, I'll present an internal checklist that I use when I look at music. Not every item in this list will apply to every piece of music. For example, if you're writing a monophonic piece, counterpoint isn't an issue. But these overall are my criteria developed over time from thinking about music I love and respect. The first thing I look for is, does a music sound intentional or arbitrary? If the music sounds arbitrary, I'm simply not interested. One good test for this is, could I take some of the events in the music and move them around? Would it make any difference? When things happen in music is just as important as what's happening. So if I can take some gesture or some phrase and move it earlier or later by several bars, and it makes no particular difference, to me, that pretty much takes away all my interest in the piece. The second thing I'm interested in when I listen to a new piece is, overall, does it provide me a kind of emotional voyage, intriguing and moving? That's why I listen to music. I may eventually decide to analyze it in more detail, but if the music doesn't reach me on that level, I'm just not interested. Now let's talk more about the individual aspects of the music. First thing is, if the music has a melodic line, is it memorable? Does it have focus? Are there clearly noticeable motives? Does it have a direction that seems to make sense? Again, part of this is just wondering if it's arbitrary or not. If it has direction and it's focused enough to be memorable, those are good signs. Next, the issue of harmony. When it comes to harmonic language, first thing is, does it sound coherent? Does it sound as though two pages of the piece are written in completely different styles? Or does the music somehow come together to make a coherent whole? Once that's the case, then I want to know is, does the harmony have any punctuation? And I'm not talking necessarily only about tonal harmony here. Any kind of harmony, to be comprehensible, needs punctuation. Whether it's tonal or atonal, the human mind is simply not equipped to handle an endless stream with no punctuation whatsoever. Just like you wouldn't read a page of a newspaper if it had no punctuation, no columns, no differences in fonts. It would just be a big jumble, making no sense. Another point, does the harmony have variety of tension? I would say, does it breathe? It's important for me overall that the harmony not be always roughly on the same level of tension. If the harmony has no tension, let's say it's consonant all the time, I find it boring. On the other hand, if it's constantly at the same level of tension, after a while, I find it suffocating. Then a couple of more specific things. I look at the bass line. The role of a bass line is to provide harmonic support at important points, and also to create a sense of direction. It provides a counterpoint to the top line or the main line, wherever that may be. That counterpoint needs to have a kind of vigor and sense of direction to keep my interest. The last thing that relates to the harmony is just voice leading. Voice leading is really kind of a common sense thing. It just means that does one note move to the next in each part in some kind of way that makes sense. That doesn't mean it always has to be choral style, but it does in some way have to make sense that one note over here goes to one note over there in a way that doesn't sound arbitrary. Again, I emphasize the fact that when things sound arbitrary, I tend to disconnect quite quickly and lose interest in them. Next, counterpoint. Does the piece have memorable melodic lines? Do they have focus, let's say with motives that hold them together? Do they have direction? Do they combine with each other in coherent ways? The human ear cannot make sense of multiple lines of equal importance at the same time. So in real counterpoint, it's not true that all the parts are equal all the time. It's more true that they're equal overall, but at any given moment there needs to be a foreground and a background. The only difference being between harmony and counterpoint is that in harmony the foreground is generally on top and stays there. In counterpoint it moves around and the other parts become momentarily secondary. Also, does the texture breathe? Is the texture always equally dense? Is the interest well distributed? Is it always in the same place, or does it everybody get a chance? Finally, does the counterpoint create a sense of harmonic richness? Because even if you're combining lines, if you don't pay attention to the harmony, again, it will just sound arbitrary. So you want the harmony to sound consistent and rich. Now the orchestration checklist. First thing, of course, is the writing for instruments idiomatic? Second thing is less obvious. Is the composer aware that the most important thing in orchestration, once the music is playable, is what we can call planes of tone. In other words, it's not just a matter of having a lot of instruments playing at the same time, but knowing what's in the foreground, what's in the background, just generally understanding the orchestration has to fit the needs of human perception, and the needs of human perception go beyond just one line doubled by many instruments. Planes of tone has a lot to do with what I think of as richness in orchestration. You may have a very lovely melody, but if there's nothing behind it, it could be not really living up to its potential. Background planes of tone can supply richness to the texture, they can create mystery, they can intensify the character. For example, if you have something aggressive, you might want to have part of the timbre having to do with trumpets and something in the background that has a rather sharp sound. Planes of tone also has to do with resonance. That's the equivalent of the piano pedal in orchestration. Since the orchestra has no pedal, it's also important to think of it in such a way that it doesn't sound dry. Another background plane of tone is often movement. The main line may in front, but is the accompaniment just static, or does it have some kind of movement that intrigues us? Master orchestrators like Ravel do a magnificent job in this area. Finally, does the orchestration make formal sense? In orchestration, we get anything from the mildest contrasts, let's say moving a line between two flutes, to enormous contrasts, let's say moving a line from piccolo to tuba. The enormous contrast should correspond to places in the form where there are enormous contrasts required. If you have large contrasts, let's say in the middle of a phrase in orchestration, it will actually make the form weaker. After orchestration, the next thing to consider is the form. Does the piece have a beginning that provokes interest? Does the development make sense? Is it coherent? Are the ideas of the piece thoroughly worked out in a way that makes sense? Are the transitions between them logical, or do they sound arbitrary? Does the piece have some kind of a climax, a focus? Does it end in a way that's convincing, or does it leave people wondering if they should applaud or not? The last point I want to discuss here is what I would call a personal style. When all the rest of this is in place, in other words, when the composer's craft has been well mastered, then we come to the question of, does the music have a personal voice? This is not the same as originality. Originality is a rather superficial notion that just has to do with something being novel. But novel doesn't necessarily equal worth knowing. You can have somebody pouring water into a violin and playing it upside down. That's novel, but I don't think there's much interest in hearing that. When I say a personal voice, it really means the composer's individual preferences and all the above criteria, harmony, counterpoint, orchestration, and form, coming together in a way that somehow makes it sound like, okay, this music is by X and not by 5 other people. Personal voice is generally the slowest thing to develop for obvious reasons, because you can't develop it if you have no craft. And it takes a certain amount of time and trying things out and sort of seeing what you really like and what you prefer. But in evaluating a really good piece, that's one of the most important criteria. And the last criterion for me, as far as the going beyond just simple craftsmanship, is the composer's music rich? Does it have emotional variety? Do we have a composer who essentially is rewriting the same piece all the time? Or can he write one piece that's tragic, another piece that's funny? You have a lot of variety in musical character. I hope this checklist has given you ideas to improve your own music. I encourage every composer to make their own checklist. It's an excellent way to focus on what constitutes good music for you and to improve your own music. And your list should get longer with time.